Hello students, this is Professor Dominic, and today I am going to try a different way of looking at our slideshow. So we are coming into Chapter 5, and I would like feedback from you all if you prefer this method of viewing the slides as opposed to just looking at the slides and reading them for yourselves. If you don't like me talking over it, let me know that. If you prefer it that way, let me know that. I am going to interject some things that will be important to know for our vocabulary list for your tests, your test on Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. So Chapter 5, as it says on this slide, it's Diversity and Disunity, the first intermediate period. And what this means is this is a period in which Egypt experiences divided rule. And it was a rough time. We have some quotes from some scribes at the time, and they're writing in a way that Old Testament prophets would have written about scourges and plagues and things like that. And their names are Ipuwer and Neferti. And the first quote goes, "The land spins around like a potter's wheel. Poor men have become rich, and he who could not afford sandals is wealthy. But he who never slept on so much as a plank now owns a bed. He who never wove for himself possesses fine linen." So, oh boy, the poor are wealthy and the wealthy are poor, and, everything's upside down. The next quote says, "I show you the son as a foe, the brother as an enemy, and a man killing his own father. The wild beasts of the desert will drink at the rivers of Egypt and be at their ease. Men will seize weapons of warfare, and the land will live in chaos." So essentially what's happening is the United State of Egypt has now divided back into all those little different provinces up and down the Nile, the provinces which are also known as nomes, and the individual rulers of these nomes are known as nomarchs. And the people of Egypt are living in chaos, which they really hate. If you remember, Ma'at is very important to them, the concept of order and control, and there is no order and control during this period. So we're going to look first at a city called Heracleopolis Magna. Anytime you see polis after a name, that's Greek for city. And you may be asking, well, why are we referring to the Greek name here? And the reason for that is this is the name it received during the Ptolemaic period. And during the Ptolemaic period, much later in Egypt's history, the pharaohs had stopped speaking the ancient Egyptian language. The Ptolemies were Greek. So a lot of times when you're hearing about things in Egypt, they're being referred to by their Greek names. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So Heracleopolis Magna is situated in Upper Egypt, which by now you should know is Southern Egypt. And Heracleopolis means the city of Heracles, and Magna means big. So it's the big city of Heracles. And it was the capital of the country for a short period of time during the political upheaval of the First Intermediate Period, which lasted from 2181 to 2055 BC. And essentially, as I've mentioned, what began to happen that led to this intermediate period is towards the end of the Old Kingdom, the central authority of the pharaoh waned. And the local rulers of the nomes gained power, and so the once united country was separated into numerous small territories. And then after about 20 years, Keti I, who was the first ruler of the 9th and 10th dynasties, claimed sovereignty over all of Egypt, and he moved the seat of government from Memphis to Heracleopolis Magna. And the ancient name of Heracleopolis Magna was actually Henin Nesu, which means the house of the king's child. And this is reflected in the city's modern Arabic name of Inasia el Medina. And it was situated on the fertile Fayoum region on the right bank of the Bahr Yusuf Channel. And it was actually an important religious center throughout Egyptian history. And the ancient Egyptian name of the ram-headed creator god of Heracleopolis Magna was Harashef, which means he who is above his lake. And when the Greeks came in, they identified him with their god or their mythological character Heracles, who you may know more specifically as Hercules by the Roman name. But in any case, they named the city Heracleopolis after Heracles. So Heracleopolis had its heyday during the 9th and 10th dynasties, but this ancient city does continue to play a part in Egypt's history. And the temple of the local deity Harishef was enlarged during the 18th dynasty, and Ramses II also wanted to make it bigger. So we'll get to him later on. The city's necropolis, or necropolis means city of the dead on your vocab list. The city's necropolis is at nearby Sedment el Jebel, and it was used from the first intermediate period to Greco-Roman times. And here you can see, if you look down the Nile, down in southern Egypt or Upper Egypt is Heracleopolis Magna. And the surviving archaeological remains at Heracleopolis Magna include a temple dedicated to the local god Harishef, and a nearby necropolis of the first intermediate period, which also houses rock-cut tombs that come from a much later period, the Ptolemaic and the Roman dynasties, so 332 BC to 395 AD. And so that's like a good 1,000 to 1,500 years before this period, or after this period, rather. And actually, Ramses II, as we mentioned, he enlarged upon what was already there and created a large hypostyle hall with granite columns and palm leaf capitals, which is what you're seeing in this slide here. So far in our exploration of Old Kingdom art, we focused on the royal and the elite funerary monuments in the area around the capital city of Memphis. And there's good reasons for this, because Memphis was where the wealth of the king and his officials would have been concentrated during the 4th and 5th dynasties of the Old Kingdom. And then high provincial officials retained close connections with the capital, and they also built their tombs in the cemeteries there. And provincial cemeteries rarely included high-status burials accompanied by decorated tomb chapels. And as you look at this map of Egypt, I'm showing you lots of different maps, but this one gives you some of the nome names as you go up and down the Nile. And during the 5th dynasty, the provincial administration of Upper Egypt began to be decentralized, and as already mentioned, some provincial governors preferred to be buried in the district or the nome that they governed. And during the 6th century, cemeteries containing the tombs of local governors and their staffs were found throughout Egypt, from Aswan in the south all the way up to the Delta in the north. And officials who possessed the means, mostly the monarchs themselves, would have had decorated tomb chapels cut into the local cliffs over the shafts leading into their burial chambers. So not so much the pyramids at this point, instead we're seeing rock-cut tombs. And then lesser officials would be buried near the monarch they served, but for the most part they could not afford decorated chapels. Or perhaps if they could, if you see in this slide here, what you're looking at is a mask made from something called cartonnage, which is kind of like kind of a papier-mâché sort of thing that, you know, if you can't have a mask made out of gold, you could have one made out of cartonnage that would be painted gold. And it was one thing for the provincial officials to decide to build their tombs in local cemeteries, but quite another to find artists to do the work. So this is where, during this period, the artwork's not quite as fantastic. So since most decorated tombs up to this time had been built at the capital, there was no provincial tradition of tomb decoration and probably little suitable artistic experience to draw upon. Provincial officials would still be in close contact with the capital, and they would try to find artists there to carry out their tomb projects, but probably the best artists in the royal workshops would not or could not leave the capital, so it's doubtful if the ones who went to work for these provincial nomarchs were actually the best artists, although obviously they were competent, but they would have been trained in the full repertoire of tomb decoration and the techniques of stoneworking and painting, and eventually they brought with them the style of the later 6th dynasty, with its large eyes and the slender, unmuscled male figures, as you see here. And we have here a funerary relief of the 7th dynasty, which is still quite wonderful to our eyes, I think, but it's a little bit cruder than what we would have seen in the 4th and 5th dynasties and the 6th dynasty. And the central government, the reason for this is the central government virtually collapsed during the generation after the reign of Pepi II. And there's no one thing that caused this. Instead, there were a number of economic and political factors coming together during the Sixth Dynasty, and this is what led to the collapse. And the decline in the economic power of the central government can be seen in the fact that Pepi II's pyramid complex was the very last monumental building project undertaken by a king for over a century. As I said, not so much pyramids now. We've got the rock-cut tombs. And in addition, from the middle of the Sixth Dynasty, most private tombs in the Memphite cemeteries became smaller. They were undecorated except for the burial chamber. And to cap it all, Pepi II himself had a very long reign, and at his death, problems arose over the succession because he had outlived all of his sons. One son ruled for just over a year, and the dynasty probably ended with the short reign of a female king, and then there's a series of ephemeral rulers, basically meaning they were in and out, and they were traditionally assigned to the 7th and 8th dynasties, and at that time is when Egypt became divided into those local regions, each controlled by its governor or nomarch. The last of the 6th dynasty kings is little known. One of them was a woman, as was mentioned in the last slide. Her name was Nitocris, perhaps, and Manetho referred to her as the noblest and loveliest of the women of her time, of fair complexion, the builder of the third pyramid. And of course, we know she was not the builder of the third pyramid, but there is a large mastaba at the same site that is sometimes referred to as the fourth pyramid, and sometimes she's also known as Khentkaus. The provincial rulers of Upper Egypt fought with one another in order to enlarge their territories and influence, and each local governor worked to underpin and legitimize his de facto authority by displaying his ability to build monuments, not least a decorated tomb for himself. And throughout art history, this is one thing that we see rulers doing. They show their strength and their power by building monuments. And of course, in ancient Egypt, that would also mean you have to have a splendid tomb. But because the provinces were cut off from the artistic center at Memphis, the skilled artists trained at the capital would have been in short supply, and provincial rulers would have to rely on whoever happened to be close by. And here we have a statue base with nothing but the feet left on it of a mayor of one of the nomes. So the various regions of Egypt gradually coalesced around two centers, Heracleopolis Magna in the north and then Thebes in the south. The rulers in each area claimed the titles of king, and those at Heracleopolis traditionally composed the 9th and 10th dynasties, and those in the south were the pre-unification Theban 11th dynasty. We know little about the Heracleopolitan kings, for they are rarely mentioned on the monuments of their subordinates. Their capital at Heracleopolis was about 62 miles upstream from Memphis, and several important nomes ruled by powerful monarchs, including those of Akhmin and Asyut, lay in their territory. And here we have King Montuhotep II, who we'll get up to shortly. So the 9th dynasty, so this is boring, but it kind of explains what is coming, so stay with me here. So the 9th dynasty may have been recognized in the south until they were challenged by the kings of the 11th dynasty. As I said, these are the pre-unification rulers. And these rulers had originally been the nomarchs of the Theban area, but Imhotep, who was the son of the monarch Montuhotep, took the titles of king with the horse named Shirtawi, he who causes the two lands to be content, which makes clear that he wants to rule all Egypt, and he is claiming to rule all Egypt. And he was then followed by two more kings named Imhotep, and they fought also to extend their control over the whole of Upper Egypt, subordinating the monarchs of that region to their rule. And then their successor was another Montuhotep, whose throne name was Nebhebpetra. Nebhebpetra Montuhotep had a long reign of over 50 years, during which, sometime before the year 40, he finally defeated the Heracleopolitans and reunited the country. And my cat is making noise in the background. Sorry about that. So Thebes had not been an important city in the Old Kingdom. It was situated in the fourth Upper Egyptian nome, the capital which lay at Armont. And Armont was one of the more important cult centers of the falcon god Montu, and his name appears in the name Montu Hotep. And both this god and Amun-Ra, the local god at Thebes, became important as a result of the triumph of the 11th dynasty. Amun-Ra will eventually eclipse Montu, and Amun-Ra becomes one of the most powerful national deities of all Egypt. We'll hear more about that later. So during the 100 years or so of division, when the South was severed from the artistic traditions of the North, people were still building and decorating tombs, although they were probably much more modest. And of course, as I mentioned before, they're using local artists. And there were distinct styles that developed at various Upper Egyptian centers, but generally they were related to a general style that tended to exhibit the lack of musculature, the high small of the back, and the large eye derived from the 6th dynasty style. And in relief work, raised relief became very high and sunk relief became very deep, often with layering of different levels of relief and with modeling of the surface within outlines. Intricate surface details and patterns were often included in the carving. So here's a stele, and stele is another word for you from your vocab list. Stele, S-T-E-L-E, is singular, S-T-E-L-A-E is plural, and essentially a stela is a rock-cut slab upright with writing on it and usually images as well, and it usually commemorates a person or an event. So there you go. So here's a stele. This is the stele of King Intef II, and he's part of Dynasty 11. And here we have a version of the style I was just talking about. This is set up at Naga Ed-Der, which is a cemetery of the 8th Upper Egyptian nome. And the tombs there possessed small, undecorated rock-cut chapels in which a rectangular stone stela marked the offering place. And here you can see on the stela somebody who is clearly making offerings. And the stelae would have been brightly painted, and they're very similar in the decoration and style. We've got horizontal lines of text running across the top that have the offering formula for the benefit of the deceased. So basically, you know, should, for some reason, no one be able to come to his tomb, the words and images would come to life and, you know, keep the offerings going in perpetuity in the afterlife. So, and then below the text was an image of the deceased or deceased couple, in most cases facing right, standing before the offerings. And male figures hold a staff in their forward hand and stride with the far leg forward, and female figures stand more passively with their feet almost together, and both figures are derived from Old Kingdom tomb images such as those commonly appearing on the jambs of the false doors, but they break the ancient tradition of showing the deceased seated before their offerings. And then the quality of workmanship on these stelae varies greatly. There's some bad draftsmanship and crude execution, and others are pretty good. Some stelae preserve guidelines that are lightly incised into the stone, showing that they were using the grid system, the guideline system, and that they had adopted it from Upper Egypt. And this is a good example of one of these. This is Innernacht and his wife. And it lacks provenance, which means there's no way to say for sure where it is, but scholars tell us that it comes from Naga Ed-Der, and it's cut in deep sunk relief with overlapping levels. So for instance, the front tresses of the woman's wig is cut at a higher level than her collar, while her hand at a higher level than either the wig or the collar overlap both items. And the details of the couple's wigs, collars, and bracelets are meticulously carved into the stone, and all of the figures have large eyes that fill the upper part of their faces, and the male figures lack any indication of musculature. And then the ancient town of Dendera in the 6th Upper Egyptian nome, some 35 miles south north of Thebes, was a major cult center of the goddess Hathor. She was a cow goddess. So you can see on the columns here that there is a female face carved in that Hathor style. She's wearing that wig of Hathor, and her ears would be big like cow ears. And Ka chapels of 6th dynasty kings were built in the precincts of the temple, and Pepi I called himself son of Hathor, mistress of Dendera. This important site continued to flourish in the first intermediate period, eventually coming under the control of Thebes, and the high officials of the region built tombs with relief-cut decoration showing the deceased and his family, and the family bringing the offerings to supply the needs of the dead in the afterlife. So this is a block from the tomb of Meraricker, who was a high-ranking official in the cult of Hathor. And what we see is a bull being led by one man and driven by a second. And you can kind of see in his other hand there is a little rope that would connect to another bull, presumably. And originally the block formed part of a scene showing the bulls and maybe other livestock being presented to the tomb owner, a frequent motif in Old Kingdom tombs. And the style has features in common with the Naga Ed Der Stele. The raised relief is very high and modeled, and the details of the men's hair and their collars and the bull's tail are intricately incised into the stone. And the men, you can see they have slender, unmuscled figures, and their eyes fill the upper part of their faces. Oops, backwards. So we're getting close to the pre-unification style. So what you're looking at here is an aerial view of Montuhotep II's mortuary temple at Deir al-Bahri, which will become important. So when the Theban monarchs claimed kingship of Egypt, even though they could enforce their rule at that time in just a limited area in the south at first, they had to behave like kings. And as always, kings have to have big building projects. They have to show their strength. So supporting such projects was one way of displaying your power and also maintaining your power, because you have to have a central base from which to draw your workers and so forth. But also the act of creating a monument fulfills the kingly duty to impose order on the world and, as always, defeat chaos. And to achieve their aims, the Theban rulers needed to establish royal workshops and attract the best artists that they possibly could to their service. And so as a result of this, a very highly competent and distinctive version of the Upper Egyptian style of art developed in the Theban area, both on royal monuments and on those of high-ranking officials who had access to the royal workshops. So they're kind of, it's that whole thing, fake it till you make it. Act like a king and you will be a king. So the pre-unification Theban relief style represents the final stage of the Upper Egyptian style. We're comparing these two slabs here and the way that they're carved. So you've got high raised relief, deep sunk relief, and incised details. And the figures tend to have narrow shoulders and a high small of the back. So here we go, high, small of the back here. And the limbs are nicely rounded, and in male figures, musculature is hardly ever shown. And the eye is large and outlined by an encircling band of relief to represent the eye paint. And the band meets at the outer corner of the eye to form that cosmetic eye that runs all the way back to the ear, widening at the outer end. You can maybe, well, you can't see it that great there either, but you get the idea. And then the inner canthus of the eye is plainly depicted as it usually dips sharply downwards. And the eyebrow is virtually flat where it runs above the eye rather than imitating the curve of the upper eyelid. The nose is broad with a heavy wing marked off by a deep incision. You can see it better on this side, on the right. And then the lips are thick and protruding and come together at the outer corners of the mouth in a vertical line rather than in a point. And the ear, it lays and is often set obliquely. Whoops, sorry. And then the same strong facial features and rounded modeling of the limbs with little musculature can also be seen on the statues. And in relief, male figures are frequently given pronounced angular breasts. Look at that, it's like a backwards L. And often with rolls of fat that derive from the Old Kingdom mature male image. So those are a bit more stylized, but supposed to show rolls of fat. And the female breast can also be angular or pointed in shape, in contrast to the curved profile seen in other periods. And alternatively, it can also appear as a long, gentle curve, often with no discernible nipple at all. And when the hand is outstretched, the fingers are drawn straight, in contrast to the slight curve that we see in other periods. And in seated figures, the lower legs are placed at an angle to the seat, and sometimes they only show one leg, not two overlapping, which when you look at the frontality of some of the other features of the figure, it looks a little weird to me. So let's look at this guy, Nebhet-Petra Montuhotep. Here he's wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. And by the time of his reign, there was already a well-developed Theban artistic tradition capable of supplying his needs. And at Thebes, the king started on his funerary complex on the West Bank together with nearby tomb chapels and burial chambers for some of his wives. And outside Thebes, he built at Dendera to the north and Gebelein to the south, both sites sacred to the goddess Hathor. And like Pepi I, he often used the epithet son of Hathor, mistress of Dendera. So here we have a nice aerial view of his funerary complex and then an internal view of his burial chamber. And Nebhet-Petra Montuhotep chose to build his mortuary complex not at El Tarif with the tombs of his predecessors, but instead at the site that we know now as Deir el-Bahri, which was a rocky desert bay in the Theban cliffs about 2 miles to the west. And he definitely has that connection with Hathor, and so this area probably had an ancient association with Hathor, so he chose it for that reason. And work on the complex began long before reunification of the country and continued on afterwards, so that tells you a little bit about what his plans are. So during this long period of construction, the monument underwent several changes of plan, and most of what survives today belongs to the later stages. We don't know, therefore, what form the mortuary complex was originally intended to take. And all that survives from the early stages consists of the tombs of the king's wives and a large burial chamber at the end of a long rut-cut tunnel that was entitled or interior, I don't know what the heck I was writing, that was you would have seen it in what became the forecourt of the later complex. And this tomb, now known as the Bab el-Hassan, was never actually used for the king's burial. It was later sealed with a seated statue of the king inside. And then the tombs of the king's wives were used, and their freestanding chapels were subsequently incorporated into the structure of the king's later mortuary chapel. And this is where you see, if you look out at this was a very complex, very huge rock-cut tomb. You can kind of see, looking at this angle, how it relates to the floor plan that you can see here. And later on, way later on in the 18th dynasty, Hatshepsut is going to base the design of her tomb on his tomb. So there were 6 chapels in all, belonging to 5 women called Kawit, don't laugh, Ashit, Kemsit, Sadeh, and Henhenet, and a young girl called Mayet. And the decoration, which only survives in fragments, showed the owner of the chapel alone or with the king, and it was worked in very deep relief on the exterior and very high raised relief on the interior. And much of the paint is preserved, but it's very clumsily applied. So, for example, the reddish yellow of the king's skin sometimes covers his bracelets, which should probably be like a full yellow or a different color at least to represent the metal or the stones that they're made of. And although the painters may have been less careful than the sculptors, it's probable that what we're seeing is not the original paint, but possibly renovation that took place in the early 19th dynasty. The kings known as the Ramessean kings were really big for going back in and doing stuff to other people's monuments. And they were also working to repair damage done to the monuments during the Amarna period, which we'll be getting to later as well. So at Dendera, Montuhotep constructed a Ka chapel to house a chapel of himself, and it would have been made of mud brick, and only the relief-cut limestone slabs that line the inside walls actually survive to this day. And the chapel would have been associated with the main temple of Hathor, and the statue would have received daily offerings through the redistribution of offerings from the temple cult. And the statue has long since disappeared, but its equivalent you can see here in this drawing, which is a drawing of the lower register at the far end of the right wall, showing a seated figure of the king enclosed in the shrine, ready to receive his offerings. And because the chapel was located at Dendera, the decoration features Hathor. Here she is in her cow form with the cow head, wearing one of the many crowns of Egypt, and she is one of the main figures appearing with the king, and it works on a number of levels, but one of the major themes is the divine nature of kingship in general, and more specifically the divine birth of Nebuchadnezzar Montuhotep being born and suckled by Hathor. Very important to show that connection. And here we have a close-up of one of the columns with the Hathor face on it. Again, you can see she's got sort of outstretched ears, which are meant to look like cow ears. And then this hairstyle is known as the Hathor hairstyle, which kind of permeates Egyptian history. So the figures of the king represent two generations, the king who fathers his successor and then the successor himself. And both kings are labeled as Nebuchadnezzar Montuhotep, which expresses an idea concerning renewal within the Egyptian cosmos. So the sun god, as he sets every evening, impregnates the sky goddess, who in this case is identified as Hathor, and she is both the mother and the consort. And then this concept is transferred from the god to the king, so that the king engenders his heir, and he is subsequently reborn as the new king. So he's his father, his own father? Yeah, he's his own father, and his mother is his wife. Yeah, sounds creepy, but you know, when you're gods, you can pretty much do whatever you want. And the self-engendering sun god is often depicted in ithyphallic form. What does ithyphallic mean? Well, don't giggle. Ithyphallic refers to sculptures or paintings of a god with an erect penis. So that's ithyphallic. Okay. So the self-engendering, again, he fertilizes himself. He brings himself to life, and Hathor too brings him to life. So she's suckling him, and he's bringing himself to life. It's his self-engendered birth, essentially, and that's part of the mythology of kingship. And by further identifying the king with Nebuchadnezzar Montuhotep, they legitimize his rule as king, for he is displayed as the self-engendered offspring of the goddess Hathor, on whom the kingship has been divinely conferred. So, strange, but makes sense, I guess, if you're an ancient Egyptian. So on the presentation of the king's statue, and presumably on the statue itself, the side of the throne is inscribed with the Sematawi motif that we saw in an earlier chapter. And an elaborate version of the same motif is placed in the register beneath a figure of the smiting king. Here he's not smiting, but the figure of the smiting king that occupies the rear wall. And in this chapel, the traditional group that signifies the dual kingship of Egypt takes on additional meaning because Montuhotep changed his Horus name to Sematawi, he who unites the two lands, after he reunited the country. So the distinctive pre-unification Theban style in which the Dendera Chapel and so many other monuments of Nebuchadnezzar Montuhotep were worked did not get a chance to evolve naturally. Instead, it was deliberately replaced at the command of the king, but a new style based on Old Kingdom Memphite reliefs, which we will see in the next chapter, where we go more into what begins to happen in the Middle Kingdom and the reunification of ancient Egypt. So, as I said, please let me know what you think of this recording and if you find it more helpful than just looking at the boring old slides. Thank you. Have a great day.